Hey everyone, welcome back to the next episode of the Culture Eats Everything podcast, and we mean everything. So excited to have Nicole Petrie on with us. She's the CEO of Cedar Community out in Milwaukee, Wisconsin area, and doing some amazing work there. But we're going to start with bailing out water out of her facilities for 12 straight hours. So Nicole, welcome to the show and talk a little bit about your experience these last couple of days.
Yes, we had some catastrophic rains here in the Milwaukee area the last 24, 48 hours, over 10 inches of rain in less than 24-hour period. And so, yes, we have had a quite a wet weekend. All of our facilities were impacted, unfortunately. Fortunately, no residents displaced, no impact to the daily care of residents. There are going to be a few inconveniences with some new carpeting that's going to have to go in and things of that nature, but so it was an unexpected event this weekend for sure. But interestingly enough, as I thought a lot about this podcast today and knowing I was going to be here today, as I was trudging around in the rain yesterday with the maintenance teams that were here for hours and hours, helping to recover from this event, really thinking about the importance of flexibility and presence and all those things that are so important when the unexpected happens, because it certainly was unexpected these last couple of days.
Yeah, leadership can be quite stormy, right? And so what are some of the leadership lessons you think that you've gleaned over the last, 48 hours?
It was interesting. I ran downstairs to grab something for lunch earlier today, and a couple of the folks who had been here yesterday and doing some of the cleanup, one of them walked over to me and said, "Thank you for being here yesterday." And I said, are you kidding me? Thank you for being here yesterday. I was here for a couple of hours. You were here for, 10, 12 hours overnight. And, you were doing the work of helping to make sure that we have, healthy and safe places for our residents to live. And so it was nice that it was appreciated, but that wasn't, I thanked them for the thank you. But it's one of those
And,
things
and
where,
yesterday
again,
for our audience was a Sunday, so
it, it
it's not
was,
a
it was
work
a
day.
Sunday. Yeah, the rains happened overnight on Saturday. They started late Saturday and happened overnight all night Saturday. So yeah, for them to be here all weekend, and then be here on Monday morning to do their regular job on top of all of that. But I think it goes to what we talked about, that presence and understanding that, my job, I tell people my job is to take care of the people who take care of the people. And there are a lot of things I couldn't do yesterday to help, but I wanted to make sure that they knew how much I appreciated what they were doing and the fact that they were away from their families on a Sunday to help our residents, and staff members who were here working, many of whom were dealing with flooding issues in their own homes. One of our maintenance folks told me that he was going to be leaving after being here for 10 hours to go home and pump out his own basement. And he was here when he could have been at his own home,
Mm.
dealing with that tragedy as well, so to speak. And it's just, I had some damage at my house too, but again, there was nothing much I could do about it. And I felt it more important for me to be here because I felt I could do more here than sit at home and stew over what I couldn't fix in my own home yesterday. So, that's where I was.
Yeah, yeah, you demonstrated one of the mottos that one of my friends who's a CEO talks a lot about is you gotta show up. You just literally have to show up. And half of the
Yes,
battle is in that and being there for your people. And I love that you said your job is to help take care of people who are taking care of other people, because that's exactly how we think about our jobs is we're here to help people who are helping people, and
right.
most of our clients are in the nonprofit world or the school world, education world, and it's such an honor when you realize that, yeah, it's a huge challenge, it's a huge inconvenience, but at the end of the day, we got to stay focused on it. We got to show up for the people we're here to serve. And it sounds like you.
Absolutely. And to add that layer too, in our world in senior living and healthcare, we're working in the homes of our residents. So, it's a privilege to work in their home. And so there's that extra layer there as well when it comes to that.
Yeah, so talk about in a moment like that as a leader, there's this sort of tension of like, I'm here, but what am I doing? Right? I can. You could help bail out the water and whatnot, but probably not the best use of your time or your skills. And so as a leader, when you're in those moments, how do you think about what you're supposed to do? How are you supposed to show up?
Well, you think about making sure that the team has the tools that they're going to need, calling in the help that we needed to do. So, and today has been the assessment day of what's next and how much do we have to replace and what needs to happen. And so now my role is to make sure that we have the right team in place externally as well as our internal team to make sure that we can get things updated and fixed and do it as efficiently and financially savvy as we can. And, again, so that we're doing as little that we can to disrupt the lives of the residents. Fortunately, a few of the residents, I mean, meaning the homes and apartments, were slightly impacted, but the bigger areas were more common areas. So yes, it'll be an inconvenience, but at least no one's being displaced. Because we have had situations in the past where we may have had residents who were displaced. And so to try to make sure that the teams have everything they need and the tools that'll help them to help the residents with as little disruption, and keeping everybody safe is really what's important at this point for myself.
Yeah, so show up and then also bring along the other resources that can show up and be helpful as well. I remember when the Detroit area here in Michigan, the power went out. It was the major power outage that went through all sort of like the eastern coast, through the Midwest and into the eastern coast. This was probably, gosh, 20 years ago. And the CEO at the time of the energy company was actually on my board at the time. And he was telling a story later about how he was about to be on TV, which we need to get to, by the way, Nicole, your background in being a TV anchor. But he was about to get on TV. And so he was straightening up his shirt and putting his tie back on and about to put his sport coat back on. And the PR person said, no, 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 don't do that. Just go on TV exactly as you are to show people that you're in it. You're sweating, you got your shirt unbuttoned, there's no tie, there's no jacket, you're in the weeds with the people trying to figure this thing out and trying to resolve the issues. And he said it was a great lesson for me that it's not always about being all sort of professional. There are times when people need to see a much more raw version of a leader in order for them to have confidence that leadership is doing what they need to do.
I agree very much. Yeah. Yesterday was a good example of that. I was trudging around with a ponytail and my jeans and my boots. And, I knew that, again, like I said, there wasn't a ton I could do externally. We have where we're located is very rural. And so we have septic systems. We were monitoring our septic fields that had water in them. And so it was internal as well as external for us. And I was prepared, to do what I needed to do. And like you said, to kind of roll up your sleeves. But yeah, exactly. And that is something too, that as leaders, I actually do training in crisis communications for folks because of my media background. And one of the things we do talk about is, again, that presence. And it's not just a presence in the situation itself, but it's the aftermath, the immediate aftermath of that presence and what that is. And yeah, when you have somebody that is all buttoned up in a situation that just doesn't fit, that doesn't make a lot of sense. And so don't be afraid to show that vulnerability. Don't be afraid to show up in a ponytail and minimal makeup, kind of like I did yesterday, right? And it was funny because there were a few double takes yesterday from some of the staff who had never seen me really like that before in that scenario. But that's what you have to do and be at that time. And that was more important for me to be here than to, I guess, be polished, if you will, in that moment.
Well, and I like how you snuck in there minimal makeup. You still snuck it. You still got a little bit on. We're not barbarians after all, right?
Correct. Yeah. I didn't want to scare anybody because that's what
So talk a little bit about your anchor background and sort of how that influenced your ability to lead. What were some of the lessons there?
Sure. Well, I was more in the background. I started off very early in my career on the camera, but I quickly realized that I was much better behind the camera. So I quickly moved into an executive producer and news director type roles in that world. But I think the lessons learned in that, there's two interesting lessons that I sometimes take away from that. One is when you're in that world, you meet a lot of celebrities, you meet a lot of famous people, you're interviewing famous people, you're kind of immersed in that world, and you realize very quickly that everybody is just a human being.
Mm.
And so at first there's a little bit of a wow factor when you're in that position and you're, with folks who are in that space. And then you really realize very quickly that people are just people. And I think that's important as a leader too, because I think showing that you're just a person and you can have vulnerability, you can have failure, all those things, even when you're in a leadership role, when you're, you have a title, a C-suite title, that it's okay to be human and realize that there's going to be situations and scenarios that happen. And you can't take things personally, because sometimes when you're a leader, things happen and people aren't happy with you about it. But when you're making the decisions you're making for the greater good, that's really important. So kind of that, the level of individual, I guess, is one way of putting it, a title or a celebrity in that case when I was in that world. The other thing I really learned in that world, the broadcast world, is, man, things change on the dime. Well, this past weekend, great example, right? We weren't expecting to be here on Sunday, dealing with the flooding that we were dealing with. But also when you're in broadcasting or you're on the air live and something happens or something takes place or something changes, you have to be able to be adaptable very quickly, and you have to do so very calmly. For me, when I had breaking news and I had to talk to my anchors in their ear and tell them what was happening and telling them that I was changing cameras or I was going to a different location or I was doing whatever I was doing live on the air, they're the face on the air in front of millions of people. I'm the one making the decisions behind the scenes, right? But you have to make sure that when you're making changes like that, big, small, live, on tape, whatever you want to say, tape, there's no tape anymore, but there was back in my day. But making sure that you're bringing people along with you in those changes and helping them understand why you're making those decisions, and being adaptable and flexible is critical. And when you're a leader, that's hugely critical. And so I think all my years of dealing with and covering live television is definitely very helpful in many, many ways.
Yeah, maintain that adaptability and flexibility and sort of the agility in the moment to respond and react. But also, I think I heard in what you said, to maintain sort of a non-anxious presence, to be sort of a steady force, I think is really important too. That as leaders, no matter what's happening inside, it is important that we can sort of hold a space for other people to process through challenges like that.
Absolutely. Being calm in a crisis situation, big or small, is critical as a leader because you set the tone.
Hmm.
And, that's really important, no matter what. Yesterday was a little chaotic, but, as I sat and I visited the folks and said, we've got this, you got this. And thank you for being here. But also, it's not going to be perfect today or tomorrow even, but that's okay. We'll get there. We'll get things fixed. We'll do what we need to do. And I think just to be able to walk around and have those conversations and say, yeah, it's a little crazy right now, and we'll keep an eye on things. And it could go the wrong way. It could go south, but it didn't. And today we're in that recovery mode now, so to speak, and evaluation and recovery, and we'll get there. It's okay.
Hmm. I love that. I love that. You said before too that famous people are just people. I played golf with a billionaire once, and it struck me after a few holes that, hey, wait a minute, this guy is human also. He puts his pants one leg at a time also. And it was sort of a breakthrough moment for me because I realized that, all these distinctions and all these sort of elevated statuses that we put on people can be huge blockers. They can be huge mental blockers for our own thinking. And when we, as leaders in particular, when we can let go of that and just realize that, CEOs aren't these unicorns. They aren't born with superhero capes. They may have a strong work ethic. They may be maybe slightly more intelligent on average than others. But on the whole, they're not sort of this mystical being. They just have risen to the ranks of being a CEO. And yet at the same time, it can be hard to maintain. You've brought up the word vulnerability a few times, and it can be hard to maintain that. So, you've brought the word. It's obviously a very popular word now with Brene Brown. What does it mean to you? How would you, if you didn't use the word vulnerability, what would you use to explain it?
Oh goodness, that's a good question. I think it's about showing that, you are, I guess, a human being. That's a strange way of putting it. But that, again, like you said, we may have certain traits or strengths, I guess is a good word, strengths that maybe have gotten us to where we are today as leaders. But that's not to say that we haven't made mistakes along the way. And it's important to not only, be able to make mistakes, but it's important to learn from them and own them and, learn and move forward. And I think that's another trait of stronger leaders is it's okay to say, you know what, that was a terrible idea, or we messed that up, or I messed that up, or whatever that looks like. And so I think that vulnerability is the ability to say, it's okay. We can learn from this. We can move forward from this. And that is something I think is a strength that many leaders have. I also think it's a weakness for many leaders who don't have that ability. I've worked for people who haven't had that ability to admit that they were wrong or that they maybe made a mistake or a bad call. And they didn't try to own it. They tried to pass it on someone else. And that is not the person that you want to be nor work for. So I think I've had the opportunity to learn from watching people do it wrong. And I would say that maybe there's times when even us leaders, us CEOs, we probably don't do the greatest job at that either. But I think it's the ability to recognize that and then learn from it, good or bad after the fact, is what's really important. Because I think that, again, if your team sees that you are willing to say, you know what, that wasn't the best decision, or we need to pivot because of X, Y, or Z, and I own that, that's really important to be able to do as a leader.
Yeah, I love that idea of just owning it, to take ownership of it and to admit it. I like to think about it like just being real, being honest, being
Yes,
open, because that's something that I can work on as a leader. I can work on being more open. I can work on being more real. Um, but I've yet to meet somebody who wakes up excited to be vulnerable. And so
agreed,
it's
agreed.
great that the Brené's brought a lot of attention to it, but I think it's actually not the right word. It's not the right intention. The intention is to be open, to be real. And when you do that, it can feel vulnerable.
Right,
But the goal is not necessarily vulnerability. I think one of the things we're seeing is actually sort of an overcorrection in that direction where we have too many people sharing too many things, frankly, about their lives that may not need to be brought to work, frankly. And we've got sort of an oversharing happening in some locations. What are your thoughts on that?
I was going to say, as you were saying that, what was coming through my brain was professional transparency, in the sense that I talk a lot about trust and transparency, and that building culture requires trust, and that requires a certain level of transparency. Now, obviously, we know too, in our world, depending on the situation and scenario, you cannot tell everybody everything. You can't be, completely transparent, because there are things you're working on that, let's say you've got a project and it's sort of a confidential project. And if you were to go out and talk about it, you may create a lot of angst if it doesn't, especially if it doesn't happen,
Mm.
right? And so you have to be really thoughtful about the level of transparency that you're sharing. Also, I think that goes back to building that trust. And so I think you're right. I think that vulnerability, or whatever that current or new phrase maybe should or shouldn't be, for some reason, professional transparency, or maybe guarded or measured transparency, was something that kind of popped into my head as you were saying that.
Yeah, yeah, that's good. I like that. It's a new way to look at it that's more helpful too, because it's people understand almost immediately, what you mean by that. It's being professional, but also being transparent about the good, the bad, and the ugly,
Right.
as you're marching along, because the reality is none of us is perfect, and um, we all work with human beings, and so as a team, we're not perfect either. Well, the time always flies by. So I want to get to one of the things we talked about before, and you brought up this idea of, you don't want to take it personally, which is hard to do, frankly, because we are
Mhm.
human beings at the end of the day. And underneath that is sort of this fear of failure that a lot of us have that's sort of constantly in the background. And so for you as a leader, how have you wrestled with, or how do you continue to wrestle with this idea of failing?
Failing fast, failing well, right? I think that part of it is when you're in a situation, in our industry, in the senior living industry, when you are working with individuals who have varying levels of different needs, whether it's someone who may be in assisted living or maybe in a memory care scenario, and or folks who are aging in place and have health issues or things happening. And I think one of the a story I like to share with some of our new team members when they come on board as part of our orientation, it's about giving themselves the grace to fail or not take, or a lesson in how to not take things personally, I guess is a good way of putting it, especially when you're working with a population that can be very challenging sometimes in the case of someone maybe with memory loss or things of that nature. And I talk about a situation where we once had to cancel a resident meeting about something, and a resident who was very upset and agitated confronted me in a very public way, in one of the lobbies of one of our larger buildings, which was very buzzing and full of people. And it was very humiliating, quite honestly. And I thought, oh my gosh, after the whole confrontation in the scenario, I went back to my office and I was just feeling pretty bad for myself, I'll be honest, about I can't believe he treated me like that. I can't believe he talked to me like that. I don't understand what I did. It was just a simple meeting. It wasn't a huge deal. And then about an hour later, I got a soft knock on my office door and his wife came into my office. And she said to me, I heard that, my husband kind of read you the riot act. And I said, yeah, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize canceling the meeting was going to be that big of a deal, et cetera, et cetera. And she said, oh no, she said, I just want you to understand something. She said, had nothing to do with you or the meeting. We just got back from the doctor's office and his cancer has returned. And this time it's not treatable.
Mm.
And that was the light bulb moment for me in at least my current world of, okay, this is not about you. This is not about, your failure in the sense of I failed to make this resident meeting happen. In not to think about things from a personal perspective, because when you're working with people and you're dealing with people's lives, there are so many things that are happening around them. And, people talk about this all the time that you don't know what's going on in someone's life. Well, that was a pretty real scenario that shared that experience with me. And, ever since that time, there have been times when your initial reaction, the kind of that fight or flight is like, why are they picking on me? Right. But at the end of the day, especially when you're a leader, you have to approach things from the perspective of this isn't about you. This is about the people you're here to serve. This is about your team members. This is about your customers or clients or residents or whomever that is. And at the end of the day, you need to think about how you are showing up as a leader from that perspective of not taking things personally. Don't get me wrong, there are times when things get a little personal and it's hard. But again, you have to think about how do you show up and how do you want to be perceived as how you react to that. I wrote an article a couple of months ago about emotion is a 90-second reaction.
Mm.
But then it's how you continue to live in that or stew over that emotion, if you will, positively or negatively, that impacts how people see you. And so I think that was an interesting early lesson for me. That was very early in my career here at Cedar Community that happened. So, wasn't the most fun thing to live through, but it was very, very educational.
Well, and there's so many lessons in that we could unpack for hours if we wanted to, but my favorite is the wife, actually, in that moment of great stress for her too, right? Not
Right.
just the embarrassment, I'm sure, for her of this public setting, but the real fact that her husband is going to be dying from
Mhm.
cancer. And
Right.
yet she took the time to go out of her way in such a graceful way to help you is just unbelievable. Talk about
That
a real
talk
lesson
about a
in
great
leadership.
life lesson, right?
Yeah,
And
that's
a
great.
model. And again, modeling the way, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, which is
Sharing that grace.
90% of this leadership stuff is just that, right? It's being the work, it's modeling the way. It's
Yes.
less about what we say and more about what we do. Well, speaking of which, thank you for the amazing work that you and your team are doing. And sorry again for all the water challenges of late, but I know you guys will get out from under that here pretty quickly and
We
continue to
will.
serve your residents in amazing ways. So thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today. I appreciate it.
You bet.